Welcome. We're going to go ahead and get started if everybody can find a seat. My name is Darren Heckman. Just got a couple things I want to remind everybody before I introduce our moderator. If you haven't already, you might want to check in on your phone with our mobile site for the conference, Biodiesel Connect. We'll be giving away a gift card to a lucky participant today. All you got to do is check into the session. If you haven't already done so, it's connect.biodieselconference.org. You just check in, find the conference this session, check in. Your name will be in the drawing for an Amazon gift card at the end of the session today. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our moderator for the session, Dennis Clark with the United Soybean Board. Dennis.
Thank you. Good morning. Like Darren said, I'm a director for the United Soybean Board from the state of Kentucky. There I farm corn, soybeans, and wheat with my wife and my son, so we are a family farm. Today I'd first like to introduce Don Scott. Don serves as the Director of Sustainability for the National Biodiesel Board. NBB is the first national association of fuel producers to deliver and adopt their very own sustainability principles. The work of Don and his team serves to better qualify how biodiesel serves those principles, such as reducing greenhouse gases and protecting soil and water resources, and augmenting the food supply. Here to tell us more is Don Scott.
Thank you, Dennis. And thanks for everybody who's filtering in for our session today. I'm going to see if I can practice a little bit of what we learned in the general session. And the theme for our session is how biodiesel makes the world a better place. So maybe I should ask, is it ridiculous that biodiesel makes the world a better place? Or biodiesel can make the world a better place? And I've titled my presentation today, Protein Pants and the Biodiesel Belt Buckle. Maybe it sounds a little bit like a fable, and there's no reason why that title should make any sense to you. And I'm going to hold you in suspense a little bit, but maybe it'll become clear, maybe it won't. I'll come back to that. But the theme of this session and our other presenters are going to talk about how biodiesel makes the world a better place. And in general terms, I think biodiesel is very powerful because it captures and it stores solar energy. And that's a trait of biodiesel and agriculture in general, is that we're taking solar energy and we're using renewable resources and combining those to make things that we need. We're making food and fuel. And I think that's a really powerful thing when we also recognize that biodiesel creates jobs and economic activity. And, they're saying that we are transitioning from a manufacturing economy to a service economy. And, and I participate in that. I get paid to write emails and make PowerPoint presentations. And so the economy works when we're all doing services to each other. I take pride in the fact that I work for people that are out there in the fields making real stuff. And to me, if we want a strong economy, we have to have real stuff at the bottom of our economy. And that's what grew this nation originally, was extraction of natural resources, timber and mineral resources, iron ore, gold, silver, petroleum, and coal, all those things that we found in the environment, and we turned them into wealth. And we've populated the whole continent, and now we're looking for how do we continue to infuse wealth into this economy without draining all of our natural resources. And the sun is this one miraculous resource that's delivered to us fresh every day. We get new photons bouncing off of our roofs, and we can take that energy and convert it into food and fuel and make it into things that are valuable, things that we need, food and fuel, and things that are worth money, things that infuse real wealth into our economy. Biodiesel makes the world a better place by reducing harmful tailpipe emissions and reducing pollution risks to water and the environment. Biodiesel makes the world a better place by reducing greenhouse gas emissions and reducing the cost of nutritious food and reducing the footprint of agriculture. And it's these last two bullet points that I really want to talk about today. What I'm proposing here may be a little bit counterintuitive, or maybe a little bit controversial. Maybe you've heard the opposite. Maybe you heard that biodiesel competes with food, or that we will eventually run out of land resources if we try and use agriculture to satisfy all of these needs. But I think what I've put up here is true. So I would say, is it ridiculous that biodiesel could reduce the cost of nutritious food? And I'm going to spend most of my time up here explaining in detail, but I'll start with the bullet points of why I think this is true. I'll start with biodiesel reduces the cost of protein. Protein is the limiting factor in our food supply. And when we grow protein to feed the world, we get more fat than we can eat. And it's because of this that is related to how biodiesel makes protein cheaper. We don't grow oil seeds like soybeans just to make biodiesel. We grow them for the protein, and when we grow that protein, we get more oil from that bean than we can eat. And if we saturate the market for oil, the oil is not worth very much on the market, and perhaps it's not even worth as much as it costs to produce it. So the people that are buying the protein have to pay for the cost of producing that whole bean. And if we can develop markets for other uses like biodiesel, we can provide a value for that excess oil and reduce the price for protein on the market. And that helps the farmers and helps the crushers, makes protein from soy be more competitive with other sources of protein in the market. And I'm going to talk more about the value and the importance of protein in the market. And when I say that biodiesel protects the land and habitat, this is my thesis of why I think that's true, that soybeans are actually the most efficient crop for producing protein. We produce more protein per acre from soybeans than any other crop that we grow. And it just so happens that biodiesel makes soy protein a more competitive crop, makes soy protein more competitive against other sources of protein. And so by promoting more efficient crops, if biodiesel has a role in that, it reduces the land required to meet our demand for food. And I want to talk more about what is our demand for food and our demand for protein. Before I move on, I will recognize that everything we do in biodiesel relates specifically to public policy. And you can see this chart that shows the growth of biodiesel volumes over the last decade. It's resulting from effective public policy, starting with the biodiesel tax credit in 2005, and then implementation of the Renewable Fuel Standard in 2011. You can see that biodiesel grows when both of these policies are working together. And when those policies aren't working perfectly or when they're failing, biodiesel falters and sometimes contracts. But we have good policy, we have a good biofuel market. And so I want to address the critics of biofuels and the critics of biofuel policy. And I borrowed an image here from a report that came out from the National Wildlife Federation in December. And it was convenient to use this image for my slide. But this report's not necessarily unique. We've heard this time and time again about the conflict or the competition for land and the competition for food as the major criticism of biofuel. And I want to address the criticism because, well, yes, they're right that we should be protecting wildlife, we should be protecting native species, we should be good stewards of the land. But I think if they don't understand the demand for food and they don't understand what agriculture produces, they may be missing the point, or they may come to the wrong conclusion. I want to address their conclusion that they say the RFS, or the Renewable Fuel Standard, is broken and it must be fixed. And I would say to the contrary, that the Renewable Fuel Standard is the most successful and the most protective biofuel policy that we have in the world. If anything, we are guilty of criticizing the RFS for not being aggressive enough. We're always telling EPA they should include higher volumes for biodiesel because we're ready to satisfy that demand. But the RFS has shown it's been successful, that the volumes required for biodiesel and ethanol have always been met for the program when they were mandated. And that we have confidence that that fuel in the market is displacing petroleum and creates a greenhouse gas benefit because all of the fuels that are eligible for the program have to meet a minimum GHG threshold. And when EPA assesses that GHG reduction level, they include indirect land use change, which is a very conservative, very protective way to do indirect land use change to give us confident that we know the greenhouse gas benefit we're getting is at least as good as those minimum thresholds. The RFS also has some waiver privileges built in. EPA has shown that they're not afraid to use those waivers in the event that they view that there will either be bottlenecks in supply or increases in cost of fuel or increase in cost of other commodities. And the last thing on my list of why the Renewable Fuel Standard is one of the most protective fuel policies in the world is because it has a strict prohibition of land conversion for biofuels. The RFS was enacted in 2007 under the Energy Independence and Security Act, and there's a clause in there that says we will not allow any land conversion for the purpose of making biofuels for this program after 2007. And that strict provision doesn't occur in any other biofuels policy. The California Low Carbon Fuel Standard does not have a strict prohibition on land conversion. The Renewable Energy Directive in Europe does not have a strict prohibition on land conversion of any type. So these are a few reasons why I think the RFS is a good policy. It's working and it is protective at the same time. But I do want to address their concerns, and I don't want to be dismissive of their concerns, and I don't want to give too much time to our critics, but I also, I'll read in their own words to summarize what their concerns are. And a quote from that report says, with American farmers growing more corn today than any time since the Great Depression, 40% of that crop now goes to produce fuel rather than feeding people or livestock. The staggering scale and swift rise of this massive biofuel industry has profound impacts on the environment as farmers cleared land, drained wetlands, and applied more fertilizers, pesticide, and irrigation water to maximize their production. And I want to address all of those concerns today. And I should note that paper was specifically criticizing corn ethanol. Nowhere in that paper did they mention soybeans or biodiesel. But that's just one example, and it's not uncommon to find people that are asking those questions. When the National Biodiesel Board goes to EPA or when we go into states and local jurisdictions that are thinking about promoting biodiesel, because most people agree that biodiesel is a good fuel and has good properties, we often get these questions about how much biodiesel can we make before we start competing with food resources, and are we going to have to farm more and more land to meet demand for this product? And I'm very comfortable talking about soybean oil as a surrogate for all the biodiesel feedstocks, but I do want to recognize that biodiesel is the most biodiverse fuel in the market today. In recent years, about half of the biomass-based diesel has been made using soybean oil. In 2015, 7% of that was made from canola oil, with approximately equal portions of the remainder being made up of used cooking oil, animal fats, and distiller's corn oil from the back end of an ethanol plant. So we are biodiverse. I'm going to simplify things a little bit, and I'm going to talk a lot about soy today. But I want to recognize that all of our feedstocks essentially come from the land, just as our food comes from the land. All of our food comes from plants. We want to protect the land, and we want to supply healthy, abundant food. And so in considering the land, which is the base of all of these resources, all these feedstocks are going to come from the land. This is a map that I borrowed from the Department of Energy. Department of Energy has been, they've been doing lots of analysis trying to assess what is the capacity to produce biomass for bioenergy. They've targeted 1 billion tons of biomass for bioenergy. And they've focused a lot of effort on cellulosic biomass that could turn into fuel. But I also think there is a lot of untapped promise in conventional biofuels, cornstarch ethanol and biodiesel from fats and oils. But regardless, we can see from this map that our highest potential for biomass production is in the farming region of the Midwest. So we might otherwise, consider that the grain belt. And, Steve Kafka's always done a great job talking about this impressive resource we have in the United States. We have rich, fertile soils. We have a good climate. We have lots of rainfall. And we have farmers who know what they're doing. We have some of the best technology in the world. This is a great place to produce biomass. You might also know it as the breadbasket. And one of the things that I want to emphasize today is that the breadbasket produces more than just bread. And if we look at just the two primary crops that we grow in the United States, I'm only going to look at two, the largest, corn and soybeans. In 2015, we harvested 13.6 billion bushels of corn and 3.9 billion bushels of soybean. And together, those two crops provided 150 billion pounds of protein, 600 billion pounds of carbohydrates, and 75 billion pounds of fat. And so these pie graphs show the constituents of a corn kernel and a soybean to show us where that's coming from, why we're getting protein, carbohydrates, and fat when we harvest these crops. And you can see, corn is largely a starch crop. 77% of a corn kernel is soluble carbohydrates with 9% protein and 4% oil. Soybean is really unique because it has a really high ratio of protein, 36% protein, 19% oil, 9% soluble carbohydrates, almost 30% total carbohydrates if we include the insoluble fiber that's in soybeans. And so if we pause a little bit to think about why is this that plants have this large capacity for storing solar energy? All plants store solar energy. The cellulosic fibers are insoluble carbohydrates, and all the plant stems and leaves store solar energy. Nature sort of designed that cellulosic material to be tough and resilient and last a long time. But if we look particularly at the seeds of a plant, nature's designed plants to store lots of simple carbohydrates and fats in seeds as a very quick way to release that energy for plant growth. So a seed has to carry its own stored solar energy between the time it germinates and between the time it grows its first leaves, its first solar collectors. It has to have stored solar energy. So that's why we see that plants store lots of solar energy in fats and carbohydrates. And relative to what we use these seeds for, we use them for food. Animals and humans require a much higher ratio of protein to fats and carbs in our diet. But this is what the plant world is giving us lots of stored energy. And so going back to the bread basket, recognizing the bread basket gives us more than just bread, gives us 150 billion pounds of protein, 600 billion pounds of carbohydrates, and 75 billion pounds of fat. And recognizing that all of this protein goes to the food supply. 150 billion pounds of protein are going into our food supply. And when we raise this protein to meet demand for food, we get more fats and carbohydrates than we can eat. So that was the genesis of the biofuels industry. But we eat or we feed 100% of this protein into the food. And so given the choice between talking about the bread basket or the grain belt, I'd say the grain belt is a little bit better of a term because it doesn't betray the fact that we're producing much more than just carbohydrates that go into bread. And in fact, I think protein is so important to this story that I would suggest that we could think of it this way, that the grain belt holds up America's protein pants. And I admit that I'm being kind of silly up here trying to rename Middle America, but I'm embarrassing myself with this pun or this bad analogy or whatever it is to emphasize a point that protein is important. And I want to recognize that all these crops that we grow because we have to have that protein for our food supply. And I want to talk more about the food supply as well. So recognizing that the bread basket produces more than just bread, and recognizing that that's good because man cannot live on bread alone, let's look at what do we need for our food supply. Our food must contain calories from proteins, carbohydrates, and fats. And specifically, we should be aiming for this ratio. We should be getting 30% of our calories from protein, 50% of our calories from carbohydrates, and 20% of our calories from fat. So our food must contain protein, carbohydrates, and fat. And therefore, agriculture must produce protein, carbohydrates, and fat. And so our goal, if we want to be good stewards of the land, is we need to manage the land to optimize the most efficient production of protein, carbohydrates, and fat. Now, I think when biofuel opponents look at the sprawling farmland in the United States and see rows and rows of corn stalks taller than your head, they would rather see some space set aside for birds and bunnies, for wildlife, for natural habitat. And that's certainly true. Like I would say to them, that's right. We do need to save some land for natural habitat. We need to save some land for natural species. So this is important. So this is so important that we need to be sure we know what we're talking about when we start prescribing policies that would impact this. And I would say that when people, without understanding the protein that we need from the land and the crop's abilities to supply protein, we could draw some incorrect conclusions about biofuels and specifically the RFS. And when groups call on Congress to fix the broken renewable fuel standard in order to lower the demand for corn, they might actually, end up lowering the production of protein. And so that's what I would ask. If we have to have protein in our food and when agriculture has to produce protein, if we were to do away with biofuels in a hypothetical scenario, what would we do to satisfy that need for protein? And I'll propose a completely hypothetical situation that because I think anybody that understands the gasoline market would say if you did away with the RFS, you wouldn't necessarily do away with ethanol. And if you did away with ethanol, you wouldn't necessarily do away with all the corn that we grow. But hypothetically, if that were true, kind of at the simplistic level of thinking that some of the biofuel critics exercise, let's imagine that reducing corn and soy production will reduce protein production, and all that protein is currently being consumed in the food supply. So cutting corn and soy means cutting food production or food consumption or replacing the protein from another source. And I'm going to go with this latter scenario, that we're going to assume that we're not going to reduce the protein in our food supply. Getting rid of the corn harvest that goes to ethanol will reduce protein by about 26 billion pounds. Getting rid of the soy that goes to biodiesel will get rid of about 9 billion pounds of protein. So in total, we would end up with a 35.6 billion pound deficit in our protein supply. And so our choice then is like, well, we need this protein to feed people, so how are we going to grow it? And these are some of our choices. This graph just shows the protein production per acre for some various crops that we grow in the U.S. And you can see clearly that soybeans is the most efficient. We get more protein per acre from soybeans. Corn is a close second with a lot of protein per acre. Any of the other crops all produce some protein, but it's slightly lower. So for my hypothetical scenario, I'm going to choose miscanthus. Miscanthus is, let's assume that it's a crop that we can grow in lots of places around the U.S., so we won't have a problem there. It's also one of the crops that's promoted by some of the groups that say we should have less corn and soy and we should have more perennial grasses. So for our hypothetical scenario, let's see what would happen. So if we got rid of all the biofuels, we might potentially free up 31 million acres of corn and 9 million acres of soy. But in order to replace that protein in the food supply, we'd have to grow 72.6 million acres of a crop like miscanthus. So what we would get from this hypothetical scenario, getting rid of biofuels could mean 40 million acres less corn and soy, 72 million acres of a crop like miscanthus, and the net result would be 32 million acres less that we could set aside for wildlife and natural habitat. Because in this scenario, we wouldn't be using the most efficient crops for producing protein. I think it all goes back to this chart, that we want to promote the crops that produce the most protein per acre if protein is the limiting factor in our food supply. And I'll argue that it is. But let's address that question. What about the food supply? Do we really need all of this protein? And is there a potential that biodiesel could rob fat from the food supply? And so let's start with understanding what drives protein consumption. The first is basic human biology, that we have to have protein in our diet. We should be shooting for this ratio, 30% of our calories from protein, 50% of our calories from carbohydrates, and 20% of our calories from fat. Basic human biology. Now, we have to consume protein. We do have some choice over the source of our protein. And that is a lot of factors. And what we choose to eat is a social choice based on where you grew up, the region, and your family, and also price. So if we think, let's look a little bit at what we pay for protein in the grocery store. And this is data I've shared with you before. These are just some common staples in your grocery store ranked by price, by what you pay per calorie. And you can see all your high protein foods are at the top. You're going to pay more for protein, and your fats and carbohydrate foods are lower priced at the bottom of that table. If we dissect that a little bit more carefully, you can see that if you go to the grocery store to buy 1,000 calories of protein, you're going to pay between 90 cents and almost $3 for 1,000 calories of protein. Whereas you can buy 1,000 calories of carbohydrates or fats for less than 50 cents, and as low as 15 cents for 1,000 calories of fat in some cases. So if we're concerned about the food supply and we ask ourselves, well, how do we make food cheaper? I would argue that the place to look is to decrease the price of protein. We have to have protein in our diet, and we're currently paying orders of magnitude more for our protein calories than the calories we consume from fats and carbs. So it's fortunate for us that biodiesel actually decreases protein prices. And because we're providing a market for unused oil, we can lower the price of soy protein at the crusher. And we can quantify that. So the current size of the biodiesel industry, we've reduced protein prices in the order of $20 to $40 per ton. And maybe this is not a large impact, but it is an impact that we can quantify, and it's an impact in the right direction. So if we want more of this impact, well, more biodiesel would help us make protein even cheaper. And if we got rid of biodiesel, protein would be more expensive. There's another reason why fat is so cheap. Part of it is because we overproduce it because we're trying to drive production to meet protein demand, so we get more fats and carbohydrates than we can eat. Another reason is that fat has more energy. Fat has 9 calories per gram, where your carbs and protein have 4 calories per gram. So when you're weighing it on a cost per calorie, that gives fat another advantage. It's also why we say that fat is nature's way of storing solar energy. It's a very dense way to store energy. It's also very easy to convert it from potential energy in a chemical bond back to usable energy. It's also very easy to convert it into biodiesel. So I like to quantify how much fat do we overproduce, and I'll make you a deal. If you guys continue to pay attention to me, I'll skip some of the math. I'd normally like to drag this out and make you follow all of the math, but I'll skip ahead to asking the question, how much fats and carbohydrates do we overproduce? So we have to consume our calories in ratio, 30% of our calories from protein, 50% from carbohydrates, and 20% from fat. If we sort of break that down in a per unit of protein ratio, for every unit of protein, we should be consuming 1 2/3 unit of carbohydrates or 2/3 units of fat. And if we compare that to what we produce and subtract out the excess, for every pound of protein we produce 2.4 pounds of excess carbohydrates and 0.2 of a pound of excess fat. So this is just looked on the ratios of all we produce from corn and soy together. And if you look at those comparisons, you say, well, that's a lot of excess carbohydrates, and it's a little bit of excess fat, but not near as much, 1/10 as much. Well, that has to do with the crops we grow. We grow 14 billion bushels of corn and only 4 billion bushels of soy. So our excess is weighted to the carbohydrates that come from that very large corn crop. But nevertheless, we have excesses of both. And so if we look at what that is out of our total production, we are oversupplying carbohydrates by 350 billion pounds and oversupplying fat by 30 billion pounds. And I am oversimplifying a lot by only looking at what we produce from corn and soy. But if we compare that to what we use for biofuel, we overproduce carbs by 350 billion pounds. That's 350 billion pounds of carbohydrates that we can't possibly eat, can't physically eat it in ratio to the protein that we produce. We use 194 billion pounds of starch for ethanol. On the biodiesel side, we overproduce fat by 30 billion pounds. We use 5 billion pounds of soybean oil for biodiesel. We use about 1 billion pounds of corn oil for biodiesel. In total, we use about 10 billion pounds of fat for biodiesel, but that includes a lot of other feedstocks that aren't included in what I'm adding up here from corn and soy. And so again, looking at why is this fat left over? If we look at the ratios again of what we require in our diet relative to the ratios of protein and fat that's in a soybean, that explains why we have this excess fat. Now, I haven't included in here the fact that we export half of our soybeans as whole beans to go to Asia and China. But that doesn't really impact the conclusion, because it's not about the absolute tonnage of excess fat. It's about these ratios and the fact that we will never overcome these ratios. We export half of our soybean crop. We're satisfying protein demand in Asia, and they also get more fat than they can eat in Asia. And if we have to grow more soybeans to meet demand in the U.S., when we grow more soybeans, we will get more excess fat. When the population grows, we have more mouths on the planet to feed, we have to grow more protein. And when we grow more protein, we're going to get more excess fat. And when we improve the standard of living, when people's affluence grows, they tend to consume more protein. They tend to consume more meat and eat higher up the food chain. So all of these things that drive additional protein demand will also drive additional fat overproduction. This is a challenge for the oilseed industry. It's good news for the biodiesel industry, because it goes to show that there will always need to be continual growth in biodiesel. We always brag about we're growing biodiesel through diversity. We're constantly looking for new things to grow to make biodiesel. We're constantly looking for innovations to take more of the existing waste and turn that into biodiesel. But in addition to that growth, we're also going to need continued growth in biodiesel, because as we meet demand for protein, we're going to continue to have more excess fats. So this all supports what I'll call, the convenient truth that when we grow protein to feed the world, we get more carbs and fat than we can eat. And so I'll go back to our critics and ask us to fact check some of the things they're saying. We're entering into this new era of fact checking, and I'm glad to participate in that part of it. So they claim that farmers are growing more corn since the Great Depression. And I would say that is true. In 2016, we planted 94.5 million acres of corn. We harvested 15.2 billion bushels. And so we haven't planted that much corn since the 1930s. The record was 1932 when we planted 113 million acres of corn. But we only harvested 2.6 billion bushels. So if you compare those yields, the farmers have increased their yield by 600% in that time, which is a good thing, because if we had to meet today's demand with the previous technology, we would have to farm an additional 566 million acres. There's less than 400 million acres of farmland in the United States. So it's a good thing that farmers are growing more corn, and they're specifically doing it by growing more on less acres. So fact check. Our critics say that 40% of the corn crop goes to fuel rather than feeding people or livestock. And again, I'll spare you the math, but I left it in there so you can check me. And I'd say that's false. By calories, only 25% of that corn crop is going to ethanol, because the protein is still going to livestock feed. The fiber is still going to livestock feed. But that's not the point. The point is that 100% of the protein goes to food. And if we're growing corn and soy to produce protein, and we recognize that corn produces a lot of carbohydrates, we have no choice but to find some industrial use for all of those carbohydrates. So fact check. Our critics say that the biofuel industry has profound impacts to the environment. I would say that is true, but exactly opposite of what their concerns are. And I illustrated through my hypothetical scenario that if we did away with biofuels and the corn and soy that produced them and had to grow some other crop, it would take more land. And in just one hypothetical scenario, biofuels are actually freeing up 32 million acres that could be used for wildlife or could be used for development or some other purposes. Ultimately, we don't have a whole lot of say in that because it's development that's putting a lot of pressure. We lose 2 acres of farmland every minute to development. But nevertheless, if we free up land because we're more efficient with our crops, then somebody has a choice to do something else with that land. And biodiesel, of course, has lots of other environmental impacts, including but not limited to greenhouse gas reduction. The biofuels currently being used under the Renewable Fuel Standard reduce carbon by approximately 90 million tons every single year. So fact check. Our critics say that the RFS as it stands is broken and must be fixed. I'll refer back to my previous bullet points on why I say the RFS is one of the most successful and protective policies in the world, but also we need to pay attention to where the RFS is today and where it's going. In 2017, the conventional biofuel mandate for corn ethanol reaches 15 billion gallons, which means it reaches its cap. So from here on out, there will be no growth in corn ethanol because it's capped at 15 billion gallons. From this point out, all of the growth in the Renewable Fuel Standard goes to advanced biofuels. And so the advanced biofuels that will compete for that growth include biodiesel, renewable diesel, cellulosic fuels, and sugarcane ethanol. And it just so happens that biodiesel and renewable diesel have the strongest production record and the strongest potential for domestic growth to fill those needs. And this is good news because as we are driving demand potentially towards more biodiesel, we're driving towards soybeans, which is driving towards the most efficient crop for producing protein per acre. And I've continued to repeat this, that soybeans are the most efficient crop for producing acre. One is because they produce more protein per acre. But one of the other criticisms of production agriculture is the large requirement of nitrogen fertilizer. And we should be clear and we should understand that plants need nitrogen to build amino acids in protein. In other words, all that nitrogen goes into the food supply. There's no nitrogen in fats and oils. There's no nitrogen in biofuels. And we have to add a lot of nitrogen to corn because corn produces a lot of protein per acre. So we're taking protein off of the land. The nitrogen has to be put back in somehow. So it's because corn yields are so high that they require a lot of nitrogen. Soybeans has this really fantastic trait as a legume crop. Soybeans can fix their own nitrogen out of the atmosphere. So that makes another reason why soybeans are a very efficient crop for producing protein. And this chart shows a comparison between some of our major crops and the nutrient use by crop, showing particularly nitrogen use for corn, wheat, cotton, showing that soybeans is one of the lowest, has one of the lowest requirements for nitrogen and other nutrient additions. So I'll ask one other question, and that is about what drives our protein consumption. Do we really need all of this protein? Are we using the protein in the most efficient way? And I've mentioned that we have to have protein because of basic human biology, but we do have some social choice in what we eat. And when I say that if we grow protein to feed the world, we get more fats and carbohydrates than we can eat, I'm really arguing that that's true if we get all of our protein from plants. And it just so happens that most of us consume most of our protein from meat, from livestock animals. And in fact, I believe that amplifies the effect. We never get away from this ratio that we're going to have more fats and carbohydrates than we can eat. But there's some other reasons why we eat meat. There's some basic biology, some basic human history for why we eat meat. In addition to we should strive to get 30% of our calories from protein, within that we should get a specific ratio of amino acids. And it's very convenient when we eat meat, most of those amino acids are already assembled in the ratios that we need relative in our diet. So that's convenient. It's also historical, that humans have evolved as omnivores, and so there's a lot of reasons why meat has always been in our diet. Animals also have a role to play in converting inedible fiber, insoluble carbohydrates, into more protein and fat that we can consume as food. But ultimately, I think we should recognize that eating meat is a social choice, and social choice is a pillar of sustainability. There are three pillars of sustainability. It's about the environment, it's about economics, and it's about social choice. And the goal of sustainability is not to drill down to the lowest common denominator and have the most minimal environmental footprint. The goal is to balance those things. And we have to recognize that human beings on this planet deserve a choice in the food that they eat, and recognize that in large part they're choosing to eat meat. So that's what the farmers are doing. The farmers are trying to address this demand in the most sustainable way possible. It is convenient for the farmers that grow soy that soy happens to be the most sustainable staple in our food supply. And I can argue that because soy is the most efficient producer of protein per acre, and you can take advantage of that if you choose to consume your protein directly from plants. But if you consume your protein from meat, you can take some comfort that soy protein is often used in some of the livestock that has the smallest environmental impact. So we see a lot of soy protein being fed to poultry, to swine, and to dairy cattle. And so we look at our meat consumption, and this chart is for the United States, but we see a similar trend worldwide. We've seen a decrease in the amount of beef consumption. We've seen a sharp increase in the amount of poultry consumption. And so that's good for the environment. People are choosing to eat more meat. They're eating more poultry. Poultry has a smaller footprint on the environment than some other sources of meat. And we can see that reflected in this chart, which shows acres of feed grains required. So we're eating more meat, but if you can see this green line, which is the total of all our feed grains, we're eating more meat, we're producing more livestock animals, but we're doing it with less land to feed those animals. So the important global trends I want to point out here is that we're feeding more people, we're eating more poultry, eating more protein through poultry, and we're using less land to produce this food. And we're able to use less land to produce this food because we're growing crops that are highly efficient, producing protein, carbohydrates, and fat. And if biofuels have a role in this, it's that biofuels use the excess carbohydrates and excess fat, which makes the efficient protein more economical from a more intensive crop. Going back to this chart that shows that soy and corn are our most efficient producers of protein. So getting close to closing, I present the reality of land use change, and I want to separate this from the hypothetical scenario I gave you earlier. I gave you a totally made-up hypothetical scenario that if we got rid of biofuels and we got rid of corn and soy, that we would have to grow more acres of something else, and we would have 32 million acres less land for wildlife. That was a hypothetical scenario for illustration purposes. These are real numbers. This is real data. Between 2004 and 2011, globally, we've increased crop acres by 43 million acres. Now, that increase didn't happen in the U.S. In the U.S., since 2007, we've actually decreased farmland by 24 million acres. But globally, we've increased crop acres. It's happened in South America and largely in Africa. We've increased crop acres, but we've decreased pasture land. We've decreased pasture land by 103 million acres. So we have freed up 60 million acres of farmland. We're feeding more people, we're feeding more protein, but we're using 60 million acres less land. And a third of that has reverted to forest. We've grown 19 million acres of new forests between 2004 and 2011. All because of more efficient crops like soy. And if biofuels have a role, it's because biofuels are helping those more efficient crops be more economically viable by providing a market for the excess fat. So biodiesel and soy can lead to forest growth. We're able to raise more food on less acres because crops produce more protein per acre. And the markets are favoring more efficient protein production when biodiesel exists to utilize that excess fat. And so if somebody wants to fact check me, these are my thesis points that somebody should fact check me on. I believe that protein is critical. It's a limiting factor in our food supply. Protein drives crop production. Protein production results in more fat than we can eat. Biodiesel reduces the cost of soy protein. Biodiesel promotes soy over other sources of protein. Soy requires less land and less nitrogen than other protein sources. Therefore, biodiesel creates net benefits to the food supply, land use, nitrogen, greenhouse gases, and other environmental impacts. And that's why I say that biodiesel is the belt buckle of the grain belt that holds up the protein pants. And I thank you for your attention. I know I've thrown a lot at you. I'll look forward to questions if we have time for that later. I would also like to thank some of the agencies that helped fund some of this data that we use to quantify these impacts. It was funded by the USDA and the Nebraska Soybean Checkoff. So thank you for your attention.
Next up is Dr. Ray Chen. Ray is an energy systems analysis for Argonne National Laboratory. Argonne was the first national laboratory designed by the United States Department of Energy in 1946. Today, the laboratory focuses on renewable energy, environmental sustainability, and solutions for our transportation challenges. Ray's research focuses on alternative liquid fuels, and most of his work is incorporated to Argonne's GREET model, which stands for Greenhouse Gases, Regulated Emissions, and Energy Use in Transportation. GREET is one of the most widely accepted models for quantifying the emissions benefits of renewable fuels like biodiesel. Today, Ray will give us an update on biodiesel life cycle analysis for greenhouse gases. Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis. And thank you, Don, for the comprehensive background introduction, which will make my presentation a little bit easier to understand. Let's see. Okay. My name is Ray Chen. I'm an analyst at Argonne National Lab. There are a lot of research activities are going on at Argonne regarding biofuels. And in my team specifically, we are a group of analysts and modelers. So we analyze the environmental and energy impact of transportation-related issues. So today, I will be talking about the life cycle analysis, updated life cycle analysis of a soybean-based biodiesel in GREET model, mainly focusing on the fossil fuel consumption, greenhouse gas emissions, and I will cover a little bit of the land use change as well. And this is a collaborative work among Argonne, Purdue University, USDA, and S&T Square Consultants. We actually just wrapped up our results, and so everything you see today is still preliminary. We're in the process of finalize the report. So if you're interested in citing any of the data, I highly recommend to wait until the report is published, which will be sometime in March. So outline of the next 25 minutes or so, just like a typical scientific paper. It covers the background, methodology, results, and the conclusion. First, the background. In 2015, the transportation sector in the United States alone consumed 18 trillion megajoule of gasoline. And predicted by the U.S. Energy Information Administration, this demand will decrease to 13.2 trillion megajoule in the year 2040, mainly due to the improvement of fuel efficiency, especially for the light-duty vehicles. In comparison, the diesel consumption in 2015, just in the transportation sector in the U.S., was 7 trillion megajoule. And in 23 years, by 2040, this consumption will increase to 8.5 trillion megajoule, mainly due to the recovery and development of industry, followed by the predicted economic growth. So you can see that this interesting trend actually will drive a lot of fuel producers to shift their focus from gasoline to diesel in the near future. And let's just look at the diesel itself. That 1.5 trillion megajoule of additional diesel consumed in the year of 2040 is possibly responsible for additional 112 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent. This is probably not an accurate analogy, but just give you an idea. That amount of, assuming that 112 million ton is CO2 only, and that will require approximately a little more than 5 billion trees to consume and to convert to organic matters through photosynthesis. Considering U.S. is still a gasoline-dominant country when it comes to transportation, we can imagine how much more diesel is needed worldwide in the future, and what the environmental impact it might cause. And so in order to still meet our future energy needs and to be environmentally conscious and responsible, we have to come up with more sustainable solutions. And among these solutions, biofuel is one of the few that have been already commercially produced and consumed, which serves them great advantage for the future research development and the market maturity for the entire industry. And just for information, if you haven't known this already, for a biomass-based renewable fuel to be qualified for the renewable fuel standard by the US EPA, it must meet at least 50% greenhouse gas reduction compared to the petroleum diesel baseline in 2005. And now let's look back to the list of our sustainable solutions. Besides reducing the greenhouse gas emissions from fuels, we can also increase the engine efficiencies and compatibility, or we can switch to alternative power sources. This list can keep growing with the advancement of our technologies, which is great. However, this will also make the whole system very difficult and complex to be analyzed. And from an analyst point of view, we really need a model, a tool that is comprehensive enough for us to examine the overall energy and environmental impacts of various transportation fuels and vehicle technologies. And this tool is called the life cycle analysis, or LCA for short. Here at Argonne, we develop a GREET model, which is often used for life cycle analysis in transportation. Here, GREET is short for the greenhouse gases, regulated emissions, and energy use in transportation. And if the word model scares you, just think it's a comprehensive Excel spreadsheet. In GREET model, there are two main components. The first component, we call it fuel cycle, which includes all the processes that are involved in the fuel production and consumption. Here we also call the production stage of the fuel as well to pump stage, and the consumption stage as pump to wheel stage. And the second component in GREET model is the vehicle cycle. So similarly, it involves all the processes that are included in the vehicle production and utilization. So in my talk, next study, I will be focusing on using the fuel cycle GREET 1 model mainly. And before we start a life cycle analysis, we have to define our scope of the study, system boundary, and the functional unit. Here, for this project, our scope of the study is to examine the fossil fuel consumption and the greenhouse gas emissions of soybean-based biodiesel. We'll also do the same for the petroleum-based diesel, just as comparison. As for the system boundary, the soybean-based biodiesel involved processes such as soybean farming, soy oil extraction or crushing, biodiesel production through transesterification, transportation and distribution along the way, and of course, the final use of biodiesel. And in comparison, the petroleum diesel includes processes like crude oil recovery, petroleum diesel production, transportation and distribution along the way, and final use. As for the functional unit, our study is based on per megajoule of a fuel product. For example, we studied the greenhouse gas emitted to produce 1 megajoule of biodiesel or petroleum diesel. And so, and the same with the fossil fuel consumption. So the next section is the data source and methodology, which in my opinion actually is the most important part of the study, since as a modeler and analyst, we have the responsibility to ensure the quality and reliability of the data. The first key process of soybean-based biodiesel is soybean farming. Here we collected the data from USDA, and you can see that we collected more in detail the soybean yield, fertilizer, and chemical use. We use the 2015 USDA survey results. As for the total energy used for soybean farming, our data is from USDA's 2012 survey. And compared to our previous inventory, we noticed that the soybean yield from 2012 to 2015 increased by 20%, whereas the fertilizer and chemicals decreased. So this is a good thing, which shows that the soybean productivity increased. However, we also noticed the energy consumption increased from 2006 to 2012. We didn't get a clear explanation from our data source why this happened, but just based on our experience, a couple of things could cause this increase, such as the tillage practice or irrigation. So based on NOAA's database, 2012 was actually ranked as the 15th driest year in record, which we think it could be one of the reasons that contribute to this energy increase. And next, I'd like to talk about the land use change and its environmental impacts. For those of you who are not familiar with land use change, this slide will serve as a background introduction. So say, right now, I have a increased demand in soybean-based biodiesel in the United States. That will definitely increase the biodiesel production. And consequently, this will also cause the land transition to accommodate the soybean production. And this impact is a global impact. And the land can be changed from previous grassland and forest to soybean cropland, or can also be changed from previous corn or wheat cropland to soybean cropland. And consequently, this change of land use will change in the nutrient and the carbon stock in the land, which includes above ground carbon, such as the biomass or residues that's left on the field. Also, the below ground carbon, which includes soil organic carbon. Some of the models, they are designed to study just the aerial land change due to the change of the biofuel demand, such as the GTAP model developed by Purdue University. And some of the models are designed to just study the nutrient and carbon, the dynamic change inland. Models such as Century, Winrock, and Woods Hole. Here at Argonne, we developed a model called C-Club, which is short for Carbon Calculator for Land Use Change from Biofuels, which includes all above and provides a broader picture of the environmental impact of land use change. And this slide shows you the results or the preliminary results from our land use change study. We looked into 4 cases. So the first 2 cases are the cases without farming intensification, such as double cropping, whereas case 3 and 4 considered the farming intensification. The reason we chose case 1 and 2 is that those 2 cases were actually previously studied by the California Air Resources Board in 2014. And that 22.4 and 26.1 is from their report. We did land use change study using our C-Club model, and also we repeated the CARB's report to use their AEZ-EF model. So the results shows with farming intensification, that's case 3 and 4, the overall greenhouse gas emissions caused by land use change was significantly lower than the practice that without intensification, which makes sense. Just think there's a more soybean yield for the same area of land. And also, we noticed that using Seed Club model, our results are significantly lower than the results modeled by the EF model. I'm sure you're very interested into finding why, but just as a very generic answer, because these are two different models. Different models, they use different assumptions, different choices for parameters, and that is the main contributors to this variation. And if you're still interested in finding out why, I will be more than happy to answer your questions after this presentation. So in our following greenhouse gas emission study, we will use a more conservative results 10.2 from our Seed Club model as a representation of the land use change. The next section is crushing or soy oil extraction. Here, actually, most of our referenced values stay the same with those already reported by Omnitex report in 2010, which I traced back was actually from the report by the National Oilseeds Processors Association, NOPA, from 2008. However, the electricity used in this crushing process got updated by NOPA in 2014 so this change was reduced from previous 447 BTU per pound of virgin soy oil to 313 BTU per pound. Next process is the biodiesel production through transesterification. So in later last year, the National Biodiesel Board sent out a very comprehensive survey to 64 of its producing members and received 27 responses, and that is about 42% of the responding rate. That 27 plants also represent about 48% of the total capacity and 71% of the actual production of the year 2015 among those 64 plants. And comparing our newly collected data with our previous version in GREET model, we noticed that the biodiesel yield, the methanol demand, and energy use increased, whereas the other chemicals decreased. And the last slide of this section, I would like to talk about the co-products handling. And as you can see in this biodiesel pathway, there are a lot of, besides the final soybean biodiesel, there are a lot of co-products such as soy meal from the crushing process, and glycerin, fatty acids, and distillation heavy bottoms from the transesterification process. So we, because all of these, both main and co-products, they have values, we have to fairly distribute the energy and emission burdens among these. There are mainly two methods to handle the co-products. The first one, which is on your left, is called a displacement method. So here, the 100% of the energy and the emission burden goes towards the main product. And as for the co-product, they will be used to displace part of the conventional products. For example, the soy meal, like Don just mentioned, it's rich in protein. As a co-product, it can displace some of the conventional protein products, which will reduce the emission and energy in the from the protein production side. So we use that as credit and then deduce that amount from the total energy and the emission from the whole system. And the next method is called allocation method, where the energy and emission burden between main and co-products are allocated based on their mass or energy or a market value. So in GREET model, our default method is a hybrid allocation method. By hybrid, I mean we use a mass-based allocation for the crushing process and a market value-based method for the biodiesel transesterification process. I know, and as a comparison, I also did a analysis just using energy-based allocation only for the entire pathway. Next, results. For the fossil fuel consumption, here on this chart, the first bar represents the baseline petroleum diesel from well to wheel, or the whole life cycle fossil fuel consumption. And the second bar represents the soybean-based biodiesel from our previous model. And the third bar represents our updated value, and the fourth bar represents the updated value using energy-based allocation. And here we can see that first comparing second and third bar, here we notice that the fossil fuel consumption with updated inventory inputs actually is very similar with our previous results. But if you break it down to processes, we also notice that there was a slight increase in farming and slight decrease in the biodiesel production. However, the difference between these two somehow balances each other. And the next thing we noticed, comparing third and fourth bar, we noticed that the energy-based allocation actually shared more fossil fuel consumption than the hybrid method. And of course, we can see that soybean-based biodiesel can reduce the whole life cycle fossil fuel consumption by 72 to 80%. And let's look at the greenhouse gas emissions. Similarly, the first bar is conventional petroleum diesel. The second one is our old data showing the soybean biodiesel. And then the third and fourth is the updated value with a hybrid allocation with and without land use change impact. And the last two bars represents the using the energy-based allocation with and without land use change. The narrow red bar in front is the whole life cycle from well to wheel greenhouse gas emissions, whereas the wider stacked bars in the background represents each individual processes. So here we can see that the total greenhouse gas emission with updated inputs are slightly lower than previous results, which is comparing the third with the second bar. However, this change was not significant. And similarly, we also noticed that the energy-based allocation method shares higher greenhouse gas emissions than the hybrid method. And in the end, the soybean-based biodiesel can reduce whole life cycle greenhouse gas emissions by 51 to 65%. And if you recall that 50% standard or requirement by the RFS earlier, that 51% barely made that cut, but it also comes with conditions. So in conclusion, the whole life cycle from well to wheel pathway, the fossil fuel consumption by soybean biodiesel can reach is 72 to 80% lower than that from the petroleum diesel. And the greenhouse gas emissions by soybean biodiesel is 51 to 65% lower than petroleum diesel, which includes the land use change impact. For the land use change, we noticed that the greenhouse gas emissions varied based on case and model. So you can see that the range from our C-Cloud model results is between 4 and 10.2 grams of CO2 equivalent per megajoule of final fuel, whereas the CARB's EF model range from 8.3 to 26.1 gram. And the last but not least, the updated life cycle inventory did not significantly change the overall fossil fuel consumption and greenhouse gas emission of the soybean biodiesel, which does not mean our work did not mean anything or was useless. We still noticed some of the things along the way. For example, in the crushing process, as I mentioned earlier, our available data is still from the 2008, and I have this strong feeling that in the past 8 years, this process definitely got improved. Similarly, with the biodiesel transesterification process, we noticed that only 42% of the plant responded to the survey. So with the predicted economic growth, I will say this, I will expect improvement from this process as well. So that concludes my talk. And do we have time for questions, or we want to hold?
You want to let Steve give his presentation and take all the questions at the end, or? Let's let Steve give his presentation.
All right. All right, thank you very much.
You can go ahead, Dennis. Pull this up.
Next up is Dr. Stephen Kaufner. Steve is an agronomist and extension specialist at the Department of Plant Sciences, University of California, Davis. Steve is also director of the California Biomass Collaborative. Steve advises several states, agencies on biomass energy and sustainable issues in California, including the California Energy Commission and the Air Resource Board. He also participated on several national and international bioenergy studies, including the National Research Council Committee producing the recent report, Renewable Fuel Standard, Potential Economic and Environmental Effects of the U.S. Fuel Policy. Dr. Kaufner, current biomass energy crop research includes winter annual oilseed crops, sweet sorghum, and sugar beets. Please welcome Dr. Stephen Kaufner.
Thanks for the patience. Let's see. How does this operate, Don? I'm going to use the okay. All right, thank you. Okay, We're talking a lot about biodiesel, but the question about biofuels is a broader one, and it involves both biodiesel and ethanol sources, as well as a lot of alternative fuels. Let's see. How are we going to advance this?
Change your display.
No.
You don't like that?
Well, it went to the wrong slide. Let's see. Oh, keep going. All the way up to the top. Okay, so how am I going to advance this?
Try that arrow.
Oh, which one? This one? That one?
Yep.
Okay, sorry. Sorry for the technology hang-up. Oh, it didn't work.
There's this too.
Let's see if this works. It's not changing it on the screen. We're not connected.
Okay.
I want to go to that one.
What happened?
I don't know. We're not connected.
This is your presentation? For some reason it's not going to it. Well, it's not even letting us close out of it, is it? Okay, can we reopen it? Which one is it?
This one?
Top one? This is it?
Yep.
Okay, hopefully. Oh, we're just in the wrong.
Now it doesn't advance on the big screen though.
Right here, are we advancing? You know what? Let's try something here. Do you have any notes in your thing here? You do, that you want to reference? Okay. Let's see if we can just, yeah. No room to move this at all. So.
Needed some smart people. We all know that the Mauna Loa curve, or the Keating curve, is a real thing, and that greenhouse gas emissions from human sources are increasing. So there's been, of course, the large worldwide reaction to that. The IPCC process is underway, and a lot of public policy and international negotiations have resulted. In California, there's been a particularly significant response to this issue. Basically, state policy regards the potential effects of climate change as potentially catastrophic. And a lot of very forceful public policies have been implemented, including a low-carbon fuel standard, which was signed into law by our previous governor, Arnold Schwarzenegger, very famously. The low-carbon fuel standard is a response to trying to reduce the greenhouse gas intensity of transportation. And it's a good policy in the sense that it's a performance-based standard. It's potentially, at least in theory, technology neutral and fuel neutral, and it's backloaded. So right now, from now on, the most significant kinds of amounts of reductions have to occur from this point forward. But it has had the effect of increasing substantially the share of alternative fuels in transportation use, and reducing the carbon intensity of those transportation fuels. So in that sense, it's been somewhat successful as a response to increasing emissions from the transportation sector. Biodiesel is particularly important in the California policy. I think there's going to be talk about this later in more detail in the session. While we have the largest volume of alternative fuels from ethanol currently, the most of the LCFS credits and the most of the reduction is actually being carried, or a good significant proportion, by biodiesel fuels and by renewable diesel fuels. So compliance is particularly dependent currently on the biodiesel arena in California. So it will remain, for the near term and probably the mid to long term, an important avenue for compliance in the low carbon fuel standard. We're going to have to see lower and lower carbon intensities, so the previous talk is encouraging because it looks like some of the costs of carbon associated with alternative and biodiesel fuels are in fact more analytically correct and declining. But for the rest of the talk, let's just simply stipulate that there's a value for biofuels, including biodiesel, in trying to reduce greenhouse gas transportation. So I'm going to try to cover these 4 points, and I'm going to go quickly because it's obviously late and we all are getting hungry. But I want to start with this notion of the different perceptions about agriculture, and as well also competing visions for the future of agriculture. Don pointed out, talked about this briefly, and I'll probably cover some of the same ground. Just this last week, preparing for this talk, on one of the websites or emails I get from the Meridian Institute, this was one of the stories that was highlighted. A group called the World Economic Forum came out with a report called Shaping the Future of Global Food Systems. And they want a global food system that's efficient, sustainable, nutritious, healthy, and inclusive. Anybody not like any of those features? Those are all pretty nice words, right? So it's quite a long report. I haven't read it all, every page in detail, but they have these aspirations to strengthen the food system's resiliency to shocks and stressors. And they say at present the system's so complex and is driven by siloed thinking. And but what they're calling for is a transformation of the world's food system and to reach all these kinds of aspirations. And they think it'll require holistic approach. Now, this report was reported in this way on Reuters. This is how that report was summarized. Somehow, despite the fact that this global food system produces so many calories, we have obesity, we have hungry people, the agriculture sector is still producing a lot of emissions, food waste is a problem, climate change threatens it. Basically, the way Reuters summarized that report is they said the food system, to put it lightly, is a mess. And there's a picture of soybean harvesting associated with that article. The question I have is there a food system in actuality? Is there such a thing as an integrated whole where there's a place you can pull a lever and the whole world food system changes, that it's so integrated and connected? An alternative economic vision is different, and this is from Don Bordeaux, who has a website called Cafe Hayek, and this is an economic vision that's quite different. In other words, they say that it's not society in general nor the economy is a machine to be engineered. Instead, it's a process that emerges along with each of their many and ever-changing specific features as a result of human action, but not of human design. And these interactions that are generated, and the great economists study the interactions that result from undesigned and unintended orders. At the same time, you have very deep and complicated interconnections that create an entire evolving economic system. But the point is that design, so the first vision is that you have a system that's somehow manipulable on a large scale. This notion of how economies and social systems come to be is much more decentralized and spontaneous as a function of the behavior of markets. So you have right away a contrasting narrative and difference in vision. The next story on that website that had the World Food Systems story was this one about FAO's report, which says that the price of food commodities have declined for the 5th year in a row in 2016. Bumper harvests are apparently around everywhere, reducing pressure on the food price index from crops that were affected by El Nino. And in fact, if you look at the data, you can see that almost all the staple crop commodities in the world are declining in price. This is through 2015. I think the 2016 report has just come out. This is a summary of what was in the 2016 food, price report. Lower food prices than last year means that the world's food import bill are on cost to fall to $986 billion this year, below $1 trillion for the first time, even as traded volumes increase. Increasing amounts, lower prices in the world markets. So what we're seeing, and if you take a look at the big picture, is in fact historic long-term decline in price, even as world population and food demand increases. More or less without any kind of centralized design. So the UN FAO State of the Food Report tracked progress against the Millennial Development Goals, MDG, targets for decreasing population, decreasing the percent of hunger and the number of absolute people who are hungry. And in fact, there has been good progress over the last 2 decades. It's not perfect. There are still hungry people. But largely the Millennial Development Goals have been met. We've seen population increase, and the percent of people experiencing food insecurity has declined, but the total number is still slow because you've had this absolute growth population. But all of this has occurred despite the use of maize, other grains, and oilseeds, and sugar crops for bioenergy, and despite a massive increase in meat consumption in Asia, primarily in China. So we have these different visions about whether, in fact, there is such a thing as a world food system that is somehow ordered and directable, or in fact is rather the result of all these enormous interactions and variations in production and supply all around the world. And we have a criticism of the world food system despite what looks like fairly phenomenal progress in meeting the most fundamental of human needs that would come from food production and distribution in the world. Why use crops and crop residues? Well, in the U.S., we rely a lot on corn and maize and soybeans for biodiesel. And does this make sense, and will it continue? And what's the main reason? This is the main reason, in my view. It's a phenomenal, really just a stunning increase in productivity over time. 8-fold since the early part of the 20th century in corn and 4-fold in soybeans. The large circle for maize and for soybeans represent the most recent yields from 2016. They're at record levels for both commodities. That triangle there on the yellow was the great drought that we had in 12 and 13. Now, if you track left, you'll look at that what we saw with one of the most significant historic droughts of all time was a corn yield that was 20% off trend and basically equivalent to good yields in the early 2000s. So is that a non-resilient system? In the soybean, I think harvest was off much less, about 10%. I don't have it on there. So why is this happening? Well, you have maize and soybean intensification and technology in the U.S. There's just some pictures of some of those remarkable developments that are occurring. One of them, of course, is genetically engineered crops and both pest and herbicide tolerance. There's been, particularly in soybeans, massive adoption increasingly with all these other crops as well. And one of the consequences of the biofuel expansion has been an enormous wealth build in the Midwest during the last 10-year period or so. Land values, net worth, profit from agriculture. And what has happened is that some of that at least has been reinvested in agricultural machinery and technology, improvements in infrastructure, and that wealth build sustains a virtuous cycle of being able to sustain yield increases and improvements in efficiency over time. And that has come in part from the decision to shift to biofuel use for the generation, for the use of surpluses. U.S. agriculture has always been in a position of chronic surplus. We have 20% of the world's best land and 5% of the people. We always have surpluses. And the industrial use of crop, of some portion of our crop, makes sense. So what you can see with during the period of wealth build, during the periods from about 04 to about 12, 13, 14, was that farming became more profitable. And it was for many years, or a number of the years before that, the cost of producing corn and soybeans was at pretty much the cost of the commodity, or even below. And it was met up with government transfer payments. And during that wealth build, those government transfer payments disappeared. Now, even recently, with these high yields, even so, we're now back in a position of chronic surplus, even with biofuel use. So that use really, when you talk about, well, it's really has adverse consequences on price, and so it's not there in the evidence. Actually, what is this doing here? Well, these kinds of stories are popping up everywhere. Wherever agriculture starts to become more productive, more market-based and oriented, all of a sudden, local people want to have a bioenergy business. So this struck me as very interesting. Nigeria now has become much more productive in cassava, and some people are thinking, well, maybe we should make some ethanol out of the surplus cassava that we have. So I just put it there as kind of an example of how this goes. Last year, a project from UN, UNESCO, a book was produced. I helped participate in this process. It was an international analysis of bioenergy and sustainability. And it covered all these areas: effects on land use, food and fuel, greenhouse gas reductions, and so on. And this is what that's available online, free. This is what the international effort talked about with respect to the role between biofuel production and agriculture, that there's enough land for sustainable production of bioenergy around the world, that bioenergy can improve food system production systems and rural economic development, that it can stimulate investments in agriculture and development, that there's no inherent causal relationship between bioenergy production and food security, and they went as far as saying, we really need to do this. This is ethically the right thing to do. So you can look at that if you like. And so basically, this is the model that they go on, where you have traditional biomass use, chopping down forests, living in smoky houses, versus developing more intensified systems with more technology and improving the quality of life and wealth. What about, I want to mention a little bit about this sustainable intensification. Here's the gold standard. What we want in our agriculture generally is decreasing inputs and increasing outputs. If we have a system where our inputs are decreasing and our outputs are increasing, that's a fundamental core element of what it means to be a sustainable agriculture. And under those systems, it's hard to argue that you're degrading your resource base if that's the effect. So those of you who are students, though I notice most of the student group just filed out, if you really want to read a great paper that talks about what really is going on in the intensification of agriculture, it's DeWitt's paper from 1992. It's a little hard to read, but I recommend it. Resource use efficiency in agriculture.
Question about the interplay between biodiesel and
So
RHD.
we have a competing presentation going on,
Are
I
there
suppose.
synergistic benefits?
So
to blending the
what he
two,
says is that
or
when you
just
intensify,
related?
it's not that you add
interfere
just
with
more
each other in some
fertilizer
respect,
or any one factor, but
there
it's you're
are
changing a
complementary
lot of
aspects.
different things at the same
What
time.
do the ratios look like?
And this gives you a positive
Sounds
interaction that results in a larger total effect than the addition of any one of the ones in the addition. So here's the USDA's recent study on the improvements in total factor productivity, which is what that is, over time. And as you can see, it's the interaction of a lot of positive agricultural technologies, using more productive land and less productive land and so on, that has led to the basis for improving efficiency and yields over time. This is an interesting study called Peak Farmland and the Prospect for Land Sparing by Jesse Ausable and others, and I recommend it. It's from the Population Council from 2012. And what they found is that the amount of, on the top left, the amount of arable land needed per crop for the same level of productivity has declined significantly. Others have mentioned that here. On the top right, there's continuing to see, in this case, increasing, still there's a positive yield trend for maize worldwide, and very high yield trend increases for yield contest winners. And on the bottom right, they look at the kcals per dollar of GDP versus GDP per capita. As societies get wealthy, worldwide, everywhere, the cost of food drops. And what they really is talking about is that these processes are occurring on less and less land, that there's a dematerialization of agriculture that's occurring as a more or less, not necessarily through design like the World Food Institute is talking about, but more or less as a result of these spontaneous interactions, economic interactions, and technology change that's going on. And they're seeing a decline in the amount of land that's needed to sustain food and fuel, notwithstanding biofuel use over time, and they don't see any reason that's going to stop. Now, what about pollution? Well, pollution is an issue.
I just wanted to
So you
know,
have pollution
if you could
where you
share some
farm.
reaction
So the
parameters,
need for
as
energy and
far as how
fertilizers and biocides per unit of product is lowest when you have sustainable intensification. And on a worldwide basis, the amount of resources being used in the agricultural world or in processes drop. But where you farm intensively locally, you have issues. You have problems necessarily there because you're intensifying locally. So how does that get resolved? Well, it gets resolved over time. So we do have some issues. We have places, this is Iowa, obviously, in southwest Iowa along the Missouri River. You have upland areas, and you still have erosion going on there, especially under annual cropping systems. There's not always no-till systems used in those areas. So it's a real problem. And of course, anoxia, a nutrient runoff in the Gulf is a problem. Those things are real problems. But I actually, as an agronomist, have confidence that not that we will solve them completely, because there's always some leakage, but that there will be reductions in these losses and processes. So I just found relatively easily on the web a project. This is the University of Minnesota, where they're looking at field pennycress as a double crop with soybeans. Now, this is nice for biodiesel because this is a potentially valuable biodiesel feedstock. And they're thinking they can winter sow it. They will protect soils from erosion. They'll double crop with soybeans. They think that it will improve profitability and reduce emissions. There's another plus for biodiesel done. This isn't necessarily a universal solution, but it's a solution in some places, and there are others that are out there that are being worked on. So that's an ongoing process. It's not we're not necessarily facing catastrophe there. Just lastly, a few minutes about how biofuel feedstock production can maybe make farming more sustainable and have other broader goods in California. There's a number of crops, even though the USDA thinks that there's no potential for biofuel production in California, there are actually a number of crops and opportunities for certain kinds of crops to be produced here, even though this is a food-producing state, not a feed-producing state. But one of the beneficial aspects of creating a bioenergy business, and this has been alluded to earlier, are jobs and public well-being. And it's important in that international scope report as well. We have two economies in California. You have the economy of San Diego, which is glittering and lush. If you go drive east on Highway 8 and get to the Imperial Valley, you'll find a place that's pretty well devastated economically. And that's true in many inland areas of what is probably the wealthiest state in the country. You have two worlds. This is the CalEnviro screen, which reports where environmental pollution is greatest. And you can see the dark red is the Central Valley, and on the bottom right is the Imperial Valley. And I also put up a couple of months ago the unemployment rate. Again, in Imperial County, just over the hill on Highway 8, it's almost 24%. So a biodiesel business or an ethanol business or a biofuel business in these areas are exceptionally important for reducing the costs, which, after all, when you raise the cost of energy through regulation, if you do so, it's regressive. It hurts the poor the most. So investing in these businesses or having these businesses develop in rural areas is pretty fundamentally important. And so just two little examples that are biodiesel relevant. This is from 2013-14. California has almost 1.5 million, actually it's even larger now, more than 1.5 million acres of nut trees. Well, they're not always bearing. So you have young trees that take 3 or 4 or 5 years to come into bearing, and there's 270,000 acres of non-bearing trees. Cut that in half for planting in the middle, and you could have basically 120,000 acres a year of land for growing winter annual oil seeds in the winter when the weeds grow anyway, something like canola or camelina, and those could be biodiesel feedstocks with no land impact at all. In fact, maybe even positive land impact by reducing the need for palm oil somewhere. And you can see there a canola crop planted in pistachios for the sake of a beekeeper. It's, of course, great benefits for pollinators. So we could do a lot of this intercropping in California in our trees. And, you know, we could grow some of these crops in the winter. And in lots of areas in the state, we don't need any additional irrigation just because there's enough rainfall in an average year. In the southern half of the Central Valley, there would have to be irrigation, but for the benefits from the economic return and for pollination benefits, it may well be worthwhile. Lastly, last year, during the end of the drought, we had 1 million acres of land in the world's most economically valuable agricultural region. And that was a combination of drought, public policy, and various other aspects of the way things work here. And you can see summer idle on the, compared between 2011 and 2008. The bottom is the San Joaquin Valley, and it's lots of red there. This is the winter. Even in the winter last year, with pretty poor winter rains in the San Joaquin Valley, there was very little, a lot of land left idle and unproductive. Well, winter annual oil seeds like canola are low water demand alternatives for land idled by drought policy and competition from tree crops. Those tree crops use more water per acre than annuals. So that means they're drying up the rest of the land. So this is a notion where a crop that has a demand created partly by biodiesel might help sustain the productivity even of a place like California. And our analysis, this is a little complicated, but this just shows, depending on the actual yield, our yields here are higher than anywhere else in the U.S. for our canola, based on my trials. Depending on the tonnage per acre, and to generate 60 million more gallons of feedstock, you can see where in the state this might be produced, how much land might be needed. So it overlaps a lot with the San Joaquin Valley. So you can see, in fact, that might be a real positive good. So we've run very late. I'm sorry about that. But if climate change is a big problem, then I think it's clear that approaches are needed to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels and their greenhouse gas emissions. There certainly are prudent roles for biofuels in transportation, greenhouse gas reduction. If we want to have reduced greenhouse gas reduction, we will the ends, we have to will the means, and biofuels are part of that. We have a great talent for agriculture, so agriculture should be part of that solution, clearly, and they have an important role to meet in these goals. So, thanks.
While you guys are thinking of questions, I have the Amazon Smile gift card to give out to the person who was chosen at random from those that connected through Biodiesel Connect, Adam Biley. You're the lucky winner. And I want to thank all of our panelists and Dennis for moderating. We took a little bit of time, but we had a lot of important stuff to share. We did start late. Lunch will probably be on time, so I'll excuse you guys to join lunch, but I'll stick around if anybody has any questions and wants to approach me. And yeah, Dev. Dev asked about is Ray Chin's model is available.
Your model is available for the public to download, or would you be able to share that with?
Yes, definitely.
And the second question is, why did you choose the hybrid model over like just sticking with mass-based allocation? Why hybrid allocation? What's your
Okay.
justification for that hybrid allocation?
All right, thank you. For the allocation, allocation is a very complicated issue to handle. In our team, we actually we analyze based on different methods for the allocation. The default is hybrid, but it doesn't mean other method does not work. Or all we do is we provide the tool and the data, so you can play around. You can choose what type of allocation you prefer. So I guess that's. Correct. Correct. Yes. So if you have, if you're interested, you can read through our publications, which is also available on our website. So in the past, we've been working on the biofuel for more than a decade, and in the past, especially the allocation, has been some of our focus. The previous version of GREET, we chose to use different allocation methods, but just according to our results and the needs more from the international needs or standards, we in 2014, I believe, we changed the allocation method to a allocation-based, like hybrid allocation-based. Can you please walk to the microphone so everyone can hear your
Thanks.
question?
Good afternoon. Ron Cutterba with Biodiesel Magazine. I noticed when you were giving your presentation, when you discussed the yield increases by 20% from 40 to 48 bushels, you were using years 2012 to 2015.
Correct.
But when you talked about the energy increase, you were using the years 2006 to 2012. Can you talk about why you didn't compare similar time periods?
That's a good question. The only reason is so for the energy, the 2012 is the most updated value that are available in public. Because a GREET model is a transparent model, we have to make sure that our analysis and our results can be duplicated by anyone else who's using our data. So if someone comes up with a question, how do you get this data, but if we cannot tell them a clear way to find the origin of the data, then it really doesn't make sense. So again, to answer your question, that's the most up-to-date data that's available publicly.
Quick question, Fred Gutala, Advanced Biofuels Canada. In the world of models, what my perspective in looking at the policy development that happens around models is that jurisdictions each have their favorite model. Scientists know specific models, and they work to show why that model is maybe better than the others. How can the modeling community internationally come together in a way that we can get similar results or an international model that respects regional differences, that it's in the future less of a my model versus your model type of scientific landscape that can help biofuel policies maybe work better together and respect differences between regions, but also have a similar yardstick. So I'm really asking about international collaboration.
Right. Yes, definitely. So GREET is a US-centric model, and in Canada we have GH Genius. In Europe we have BioGrace. We have different models from different regions because I'll say, the different government or different organizations, they fund the project. However, we definitely aware of your concern. That's why I believe a lot of models, they provide choices. So you can choose which, say, allocation method or what, say, chemicals goes into one process versus not. So because we're scientists, we have to stand at the neutral ground to provide results or tool for the public. And it is not our responsibility. It is actually the policymakers' responsibility to decide how to use the model or how to choose the data. More questions?
We'd like to thank everyone for attending, and that concludes our session for today.